there was a hill in Berkshire where the wind never seemed to rest. The year was 1863. Below the crest the heath rolled away in wet brown folds, and the autumn light came thin and grey. On the high ground, where the pines bent low, a great house of red brick had just risen. It had been built to hold the ones the world wished it could forget. Its walls were new, yet they already seemed old. Rain ran down the dark windows in long, slow lines. A high wall circled the whole place, and the gravel inside it lay bare and clean. No name above the gate was one a traveller would care to read aloud. It was not a prison, though every door held a lock, nor was it quite a hospital, though every room held a bed. It was something the age had made for people. It could neither forgive nor hang the ones it called both guilty and mad. They would come by cart and by train through the iron gate and the quiet trees, and many who entered here would never leave again. The clock in the tower struck the hour. The sound rolled down the empty hill and lost itself among the pines. Chapter 1. The House on the Heath. The hill did not look like a place where anything terrible could ever happen. In the soft grey light of a Berkshire morning, the heath spread out wide and low and patient, and the gorse grew thick and yellow along the slopes. Its small coconut scent hanging in the damp air, and the wind came in off the open ground and bent the dry grass. First one way and then the other, the way it had done since long before any living soul could remember. This was high, lonely country, far from the great choking smoke of London, where the air smelled of pine resin and wet earth and the cold, clean breath of the moor, and where the only sounds were the wind and the larks and the far-off bark of a fox. For a very long time, nothing at all had stood upon this rise but the heather and the scattered birch, and the slow grey clouds that dragged their shadows over the ground, and the land had belonged to the rabbits and the kestrels, and the lonely shepherds who crossed it. The country people had a plain old name for this stretch of open ground, for it was a broad and empty moor, and nothing more, and so they simply called it the Broad Moor, never once dreaming in all their quiet lives that one day the whole of England would learn to say that name with a small cold drop of fear caught somewhere in the throat. Yet now, upon the very crest of the ridge, where the ground caught the most of the thin southern sun, men had come to build something that the heath had never seen in all its long ages. They had come with horses and with carts piled high, with picks and shovels and barrows and long ladders of pale new wood, and they had broken the old silence of the hill, with the steady ring of iron upon stone, the chink and the scrape and the dull thud of labour, hour upon hour, from the first grey light until the day failed. Day after day the work went on, through the wet green spring and the close, midge-bitten heat of summer and the first hard white frosts of the turning year. The men who laboured there were rough men in moleskin trousers, gone shiny at the knee, and heavy hobnailed boots that struck sparks from the flints, and many of them were not free men at all, for the government had sent convicts up from the gaols to do the heavy work, to dig the trenches and mix the mortar and carry the endless brick, and these men laboured under the watchful eyes of guards who counted them at dawn, and counted them again at dusk, and counted them, it sometimes seemed, in their sleep. They worked in the rain and in the raw cold, their hands cracked and bleeding through their mittens, and the deep cuts they made in the side of the hill filled up with cold brown water whenever a storm came rolling in off the high ground, so that they were forever bailing and digging the same wet earth twice over. The air about them smelled of churned clay and horse, and the sharp white smell of lime, for the mortar was mixed there on the ground, and a fine pale dust settled on everything, on the men and the horses and the heather, when the weather was dry enough to let it. Above them the scaffolding climbed higher, week by week, lashed pole to pole, until it stood against the white sky like the bare bones of some huge and patient creature half risen from the earth, and slowly, course by course, brick laid upon red brick and bedded down in its grey mortar, the walls began to climb up out of the mud and take their shape. The man who had drawn the plans for all of this was no builder of cathedrals or fine country houses, and he was not a man who gave much thought to beauty for its own sake. He was an officer of the Queen's own engineers, a soldier by trade, a man named Joshua Jebb, and he had spent the best and busiest years of his life designing places that were meant to hold men who could not be allowed to walk free among their fellows. He had raised a great prison in London not long before, a cold and famous one, with long arms of cells that ran outward from a single watching centre, so cunningly set out that a mere handful of guards, standing in the middle, could keep their eyes upon a great many locked doors all at once. He understood walls as other men understood their gardens. He understood gates and bolts, and the long echoing halls where every footstep carried, and the dead-eyed windows that let in light but let out nothing and no one. And so when the government came to him and asked him to raise a wholly new kind of house upon this far Berkshire hill, a house that was meant, the law said, to heal and not to punish, he gave it nonetheless the hard bones of a prison, because those were the bones he knew. The plan he drew was a plain one and a heavy one. There would be long ranges of brick set out along the slope of the hill, and within them ran narrow corridors lined on either side with small single rooms, and most of the great building would face toward the south, so that whatever thin and watery light the English sky could spare would fall upon the people who were to be kept inside. There were to be several great blocks in all, set out across the crown of the hill, and the larger of them, the ones built for the men, stood highest upon the ridge where the wind blew strongest and the views ran furthest. A smaller, separate range was raised away to the east for the women, kept well apart from all the rest, as the custom of that age demanded, and between the two, set squarely in the middle like a watchman posted in the dead of night, stood the house where the chief doctor of the place was to live with his family, so that he might never be far from his strange charges. Around the whole of it, around every block and yard and garden, ran a wall, high and blank and unbroken, too smooth and too tall for any hand to climb, and the gravel that lay along the foot of that wall was raked clean and level every day, so that nothing could be hidden upon it and no foot could cross it without leaving its mark. The ground that the wall enclosed was only a small part of all the land the government had bought, for the whole estate ran to many hundreds of acres of heath and woodland and field, enough to grow much of the food the place would eat, and enough, more to the point, to hold the whole wide ordinary world back at a safe and silent distance. The site had been chosen with great and careful thought. The hill was lonely, and that was wanted. The air upon the ridge was thought to be clean and wholesome, and good for troubled minds, and that was wanted too. The nearest town was small and quiet, and that suited the plan as well, and yet a railway line ran close enough that a closed and shuttered cart might carry a person all the way up from London in a single grey day and deliver them to the gate, without a single crowd ever gathering in the road to gawp. And here, if you have climbed this far up the hill with me, let me stop a moment and bid you welcome, for I am truly glad of your company on a night such as this. You have found your way to the Bedside Historian, where we sit together in the dark and let the long-dead past come quietly creeping back to life. Tell me, before we go any further up the road, where in the wide world you were listening from tonight, and what the hour is, in the place where you have laid yourself down to rest, for I do like to know who is out there in the quiet with me while the wind is at the glass. And if the slow sound of my voice is doing its gentle work and easing you down towards sleep, then grant me one small kindness in return. Before your eyes grow too heavy to keep open, subscribe to this channel, so that you will find your way back to the next of these tales, and give this video a quiet little push out into the dark, a single tap to send it on its way, for it is your hands and no others that carry these stories along to the next weary soul, who cannot sleep. There now. The fire has burned down low, and the door is shut fast against the cold, and the wind is walking round the house. Let us climb the last of the hill together, and step back through the years into that long-ago autumn, when the great house stood newly finished upon the ridge, and the whole grey heath lay waiting in the cold. By the time the building was truly done, it no longer looked new at all, for the Berkshire weather had already begun its slow and patient work upon the brick, and the rain had run down the walls in long dark streaks like old tears, and a soft green film of moss and damp had crept up the north-facing stone, where the sun never came to dry it. From far off, across the open miles of the moor, the place might almost have been taken for a grand country mansion, or one of the great new schools, with its tall proud ranges and its long rows of windows, and the square tower of its gatehouse rising up above the dark line of the pines. But there was no warmth in it, none at all, for anyone who drew near enough to look. The windows were small and set deep in the thickness of the brick, and a great many of them were crossed with iron bars, and the doors were thick and heavy, and hung upon great black hinges as long as a man's arm, and every lock upon every door was new and oiled and sound, and every key that turned those locks was numbered and counted and kept. A traveller standing at the foot of the hill and looking up at the long red front of the building, with the light failing behind it, would have felt, without ever quite being able to say why, that this was not a place that had been built to welcome anyone in, but a place that had been built, with great care and at great cost, to keep something from ever getting out. Inside the walls, the work went on to the very last, for a great house of locks is a slow thing to make ready. Men went from door to door fitting the bolts and testing each one, sliding it home and drawing it back and sliding it home again, listening each time to the dull and final sound of iron going into iron, a sound that would become, for the people soon to come, the very sound of their days and their nights. They hung the heavy gates upon the airing yards, those bare-walled courts, open to the sky but to nothing else, where the kept people would one day be let out to walk their slow circles for an hour in the cold, clean air. They carried in the plain iron bedsteads, narrow and hard, and laid upon each one a thin flock mattress and a pair of coarse grey blankets that smelled of the warehouse, and they set up the long deal tables in the dining halls, scrubbed pale and bare. And upon most tables, when at last the time came, there would be no sharp thing at all, not anywhere, for even the knives and the forks were to be made short and blunt and clumsy on purpose, the prongs filed down, shaped so that a hand might cut a piece of bread or carry a little broth to the mouth and do almost nothing else, lest some desperate soul should find in an ordinary supper thing a use that no one wished to imagine. In the great kitchens the copper pans were scoured until they shone, and the iron ranges were lit and left to roar, day and night, to drive the deep damp out of the new stone before the people came. And in the chapel, which stood at the heart of the place as faith stood at the heart of that whole age, the plain wooden benches were set out in their long and patient rows beneath a single unadorned cross, for the men who built this house believed, as very nearly every one of their time believed, with all their hearts, that a soul in the deepest torment might yet be quieted and reached, and perhaps even mended by the old words of prayer. It is a hard thing even now, with all the years between, to say plainly and simply what this house upon the hill truly was. It was not a prison, and the men who built it and ran it would grow short, and cross with you if ever you called it one. For prisons were for the guilty, and the law of the land had solemnly declared that the people coming up the road to this place were not guilty in the ordinary, everyday way that a thief or a forger was guilty. And yet it was not a hospital either, not as we would think of a hospital with its hope of cure, and its turning of patients back out into the world made well, for the doctors of that early day had pitifully few real remedies to offer a broken mind, and the plain truth, which we may as well speak softly here in the dark, is that the greater number of those who passed in through that iron gate would grow old behind these walls, and would die behind them, and would be carried out at the lost.Drew, and no carved name to say that had lived apt, Heath had called it Leadville Hull. It was something the age had invented, this place, because the age did not know what else on earth to do. The country had come to see, slowly and uneasily, that there were among its people some who had done terrible and bloody things while their minds were quite swept away, people who were far too dangerous to be let loose and yet far too pitiable, in their madness, to be hanged for what they had done, and so the country had raised this great red house upon a lonely heath to gather them all up, and hold them, out of sight and out of mind, where the comfortable towns need never trouble themselves to think of them at all. The building of it had cost the nation a very great deal of money, far more than many sober men in Parliament had ever thought wise or proper, and there were members who rose up in the great chamber by the river in the years that followed and asked aloud, with real heat, how such an enormous sum had ever come to be poured out upon these strange and gloomy buildings upon a far Berkshire hill, for the comfort of murderers and madmen. The money was spent now, every penny of it, and the walls were up, and the locks were hung, and the place stood ready. As the autumn deepened and drew in, the work parties dwindled away day by day, and the convicts were marched back down the long road to their gaols, and the scaffolding came down pole by pole and was carted off, and the heaps of spare brick were carried away, and at the very last the great noise of the building simply stopped. A deep quiet came down over the hill then, the old quiet of the heath that had been there all along, only now there was a vast and silent house sitting in the very middle of it, finished and waiting and empty. The wind still came in off the moor, as it always had, and worried at the gorse, and moaned low along the eaves and round the cold chimneys. But there was no one yet inside to hear it. The long corridors stood empty, their hundreds of doors all standing open upon their hundreds of small swept rooms. The locks were oiled. The hard beds were made up. The blunt, short forks lay waiting in their drawers. And down in the gatehouse, beneath the square tower with its new clock, the men who were to keep this place hung up the last of their keys upon the board, a great heavy ring of them, each one stamped with its number, each one bright and untouched and cold. They swung the iron gate to and fro, and oiled its hinges until it moved without the smallest sound, and then they stood and looked out down the long private road that ran away from the gate and out across the darkening heath toward the railway and the world beyond. The road was empty still, white and quiet in the dusk. But somewhere far off, down in the gas-lit gales and the panelled courtrooms and the grim old crowded wards of London, the papers were already being drawn up and written out that would soon send the first of them up that road and through that gate. A clerk dipped his steel pen in the ink. A magistrate set his name to the bottom of an order in his careful copperplate hand. And up on the hill, on the bare raked gravel inside the wall, the rain began again, as it so often did, falling soft and steady and grey out of the low Berkshire sky, falling on the new red brick and the clean-swept yards and the long blank wall, falling at last upon the open and waiting door. Chapter 2. Guilty and Mad. To understand the great red house upon the hill, and the open door waiting in the rain at the end of that long private road, you must first come down off the cold heath with me, and go back into the gas-lit courtrooms and the damp old prisons of the age, and turn your mind to a strange and troubling question that the men of that century had carried about with them, unanswered, for a very long time. For there had always been, in every town and every village across the land, a small handful of people whose minds had somehow come loose from the world that the rest of us share between us. People who heard voices in the empty air that no one else could hear, or who believed, with a calm and terrible certainty, in things that could not possibly be true, or who sank into a deep black despair from which no kind word and no warm fire could ever lift them. Most of these poor and afflicted souls had lived out the whole of their days harming no one but themselves, kept quietly at home behind drawn curtains by families who were ashamed of them, or shut away in the gloomy private madhouses of the time where men paid to be rid of an awkward relation, or left to wander the lanes as the harmless fool of the parish, mocked by the children and fed at the back doors of the kindly. But every so often, once in a great while, in the grip of some private terror that only they could see, one of these broken people would do a dreadful thing, would lash out and wound, or burn, or even kill, and when that happened the whole machinery of the law would grind to a halt, because no one in it knew what on earth was to be done with such a person. Here was the very heart of the trouble, and I would ask you to sit quietly with it for a moment, here in the dark, just as the men of that long century had to sit with it for years on end. The law of England rested upon a plain and ancient and simple idea, which was that a person who does a wrong should be made to pay for it, and that the payment should be matched to the wrong, and that the very worst of all wrongs, the deliberate taking of a human life, must be paid for upon the gallows with the giving up of a life in return. But that same old law also held, just as firmly and just as anciently, that to be truly guilty of a thing a person must have known what they were doing when they did it, must have understood in their own mind that the deed was wicked, must have looked upon the evil and chosen it freely with a clear and knowing will. And so the question rose up, dark and unanswerable. What, then, was to be done with the man who struck down his own brother in the firm belief that the brother was a demon, crept up out of the pit of the earth? What of the poor mother who held her own infant under the water, because a voice had whispered to her, night upon sleepless night, that the child was already cursed and damned, and would be better gone from a world so full of pain? They had done the deed, plainly, beyond any shadow of a doubt, with their own two hands, and yet they had not chosen it as a sound man chooses a thing, for their reason had been swept clean away from them like a candle flame in a gale. To hang such a creature seemed a cruelty and a horror even to that hard and unsentimental age, and yet to fling open the door and set them free seemed a horror of another kind altogether, for they had blood upon their hands and might, at any hour, shed more. For a long time the courts had no good answer to give, and they fumbled at the dreadful question one case at a time, this way and that, with no settled rule to guide them. Sometimes they hanged the mad along with the plainly wicked, and the broken soul went to the scaffold, not knowing why. Sometimes they turned them loose again upon a frightened world, and sometimes they shut them away in some dark corner of a prison or a madhouse with no law to say how long they must stay there, or who must feed and keep them, or whether they should ever come out. But as the slow years went by, a few cases came before the judges that shook the whole country to its foundations, and dragged the old buried question out into the broad and pitiless light of day. There was one above all of these that men spoke of, in hushed and serious voices, for long years afterward. It was the case of a quiet Scottish wood-turner, a man who worked with his hands at the lathe, who'd fallen, little by little, into the grip of a terrible and fixed delusion, coming at last to believe that the men of the government were hunting him through the streets, watching him, plotting in secret to destroy him, giving him no peace by day or by night. And one grey afternoon this haunted man walked up quietly behind a gentleman in a London street, a gentleman he had mistaken, in the fog of his madness, for the great and powerful minister he so feared and hated, and he drew out a pistol and shot the poor man dead upon the pavement. When at last he was brought to his trial, the doctors who had examined him stood up one after another and swore upon their honour that his mind was diseased through and through, that he truly and wholly believed himself to be in deadly danger of his life, and that he could no more have helped what he did than a man burning up with brain fever can help the wild words he cries out in the night. The court listened, gravely, and the judges withdrew to think upon it, and after long and careful and troubled deliberation, they came back and laid down a set of plain rules that were meant to guide every court that should come after them. Rules that asked, in clear and simple words, whether the accused had understood the very nature of the act his hands had done, and whether he had understood that the act was wrong. And if it could be shown that he had not understood these things, then he was not to be dealt with as a common and knowing criminal at all, but as a creature broken and undone by his own affliction. And so a strange new judgement quietly entered into the law of the land, a verdict that was neither the one thing nor the other, neither guilty nor innocent, but something stranger and far sadder than either of them. It was a finding that the person had indeed done the deed with their own hands, but was not, in the cold and careful eyes of the law, to be blamed for it, on account of the sickness that had taken hold of their mind. They were declared, in the dry and formal language of the courts, to be not guilty by reason of insanity, and having once been so declared, they could not simply rise up from the dock and walk out of the courtroom, a free soul into the daylight, for every man and woman in that crowded room understood the danger that lay in such a thing. Instead, the judge would solemnly order that the person be taken away and kept in close confinement, not for a year, nor for 10 years, nor for any fixed and countable span at all, but for just so long as it should please the Crown to go on keeping them, which in plain and honest truth came to mean for the whole of their natural lives, unless some great mercy or some unlooked-for miracle should ever come along to set them loose. The very words the law chose for this were soft and gentle words, and yet there was something terrible buried in their softness, for the order ran that the person was to be held during Her Majesty's pleasure, as though the Queen herself, far away in the warm and golden rooms of her palace, took some tender and personal interest in the fate of each poor wretch, when the plain meaning of those soft words, stripped quite bare, was simply that they would be held until the day they died. But the very moment the courts began to hand down this new and strange judgment, another problem rose up at once to meet it, and it was a hard and practical problem of brick and stone and iron and timber, the plain question of where on this earth all these people were now to be kept, for they could not very well be sent to the ordinary prisons, since the law's own verdict had declared in so many words that they were not ordinary prisoners, and had committed no ordinary crime, and they could not easily be sent off to the county madhouses to be mixed in among the harmless and the gentle mad, for these were people who had killed, and the keepers of those crowded places were frightened of them, and did not want them under their roofs at any price. For a great many years the makeshift answer had been a grim and ancient hospital in the very heart of London, a place so old and so famous for its long centuries of suffering that its very name had worn down, on the tongues of the common people, into a single word that came to mean any scene of howling, hopeless uproar and disorder. In one shadowed wing of that old hospital, the criminal mad were kept shut apart from all the rest. Behind their own locked doors, men and women who had done violence in the dark of their delusions, crowded together in the damp and the chill and the gloom of the old riverside city. A handful of others were kept far away to the west, in a private asylum out near the quiet cathedral town of Salisbury. But these old places were crowded past all bearing and ill-built, and quite unsuited to the grim work they were asked to do, and as the courts went on, sending up more and more of these lost souls year upon year, it became plain to anyone who troubled to look that the country needed something altogether new, something raised up from the bare ground, and built from the first brick for this one strange and sorrowful task and no other. And this great work was the business of the men of Parliament, and so, in a year not many before our story truly begins, they passed a law that ordered the building of a proper and purpose-built asylum to hold the criminal mad of all England, a state asylum, paid for and run and watched over by the government itself. The very first thing of its kind that the country had ever set out to make. It was a law born partly out of plain fear and partly out of a rough and genuine kind of mercy. For some of the men who stood up and argued for it truly believed in their hearts that the broken in mind deserved far better than the chains and the filth and the cruelty of the old madhouses, that they ought to have clean air to breathe and decent plain food to eat, and the deep healing quiet of the open country all around them, and the chance, however small and faint a chance it might be, that a gentle and enchaining Dalton, the daily round it in mind my buying game then. And some of the other men who argued just as hotly for the very same law cared nothing at all for mercy, and wished only to see these frightening and shameful people gathered up out of the towns and carried far, far away, shut up behind a high wall in some lonely and forgotten place, where no decent soul need ever lay eyes upon them or spare them a single thought again. Both kinds of men, the merciful and the fearful, voted side by side for the very same law, and the law was duly passed, and the great sum of money was found and set aside, and the long search began for a fitting place to put the thing they had all agreed to build. And so we come back at last, by this long and winding road through the courts, and the prisons, and the panelled halls of Parliament, to the lonely Berkshire hill where this whole story began. For it was here, upon the broad and empty moor, that the men of the government chose in the end to raise their great new house. They had wanted it remote and far from the world, and the heath was remote. They had wanted it high and clean and wholesome for the mending of sick minds, and the fresh air of the ridge was thought to be the very thing. They had wanted it kept secret and apart, and yet within an easy reach of the great capital, and the little railway that ran close by could carry a closed and shuttered cart all the way up from London in the course of a single day, so that a person found guilty and mad in a London court on the Monday might be delivered, silent and unseen, to the gate upon the hill before that same week was out, without a single idle crowd ever gathering in the road to stare and to point. The place had every single thing the planners had set their hearts upon, and so they'd bought up the wide acres of it, and sent up the convicts and the engineers, and raised the long red ranges and hung the heavy iron gates, all of it, every brick and bolt of it, for the sake of that one strange judgement that had been handed down in the courtrooms below, the judgement that a person might do a murder, and yet not be a murderer in the eyes of the law, might be guilty in the cold fact of the deed, and yet not guilty in the both rafed, been mad, but nan might be. It is worth our while to stop here a moment in the quiet, and to feel the full and heavy weight of what that strange judgment truly meant for the men and the women whose papers were even now being signed and sealed in the city below, ready to start them on their road. For they were not climbing the hill to serve out a sentence, as a common prisoner serves his, and there lies the whole sorrow of it, for a sentence, however long and however hard, has an ending somewhere at the far end of it, and a prisoner may lie awake on his hard board and count off the days, one by one, until the morning when his door at last swings open and he walks back out into the free and ordinary light. These people had no such door waiting for them at the end of any number of counted days. They were being sent up to a place that had no end built into it at all, ordered there during the pleasure of a queen who would never once hear their names spoken, nor know that they had ever drawn breath. To be kept until that royal pleasure should change, which it almost never, ever did. The doctors who were waiting up on the hill to receive them believed, most of them in all sincerity, that they were doing a true kindness, and by the hard and pitiless measure of that age perhaps in truth they were, for the rooms were swept and clean, and the food, though plain and grey, was enough to keep body and soul together, and no man would be flogged in chains there as the old mad houses had once flogged their wretches for the sport of paying visitors. But it was a kindness with a high blank wall built all around it, and a mercy with a heavy iron lock set fast upon its door, and the great number of the people who would climb that hill to receive it would climb it only the once, and would never in all their remaining years come down again, and would be laid at the last beneath the rough grass of the burying ground within the wall, with no carved stone to say that they had ever lived, or wept, or been a child once, loved by someone. Already down in the city, the first of the papers were moving quietly through the inky hands of the clerks. In some city court, a magistrate would write out the order in his careful looping copperplate hand, and dust the wet ink with fine sand, and the order would be carried by a messenger to the prison or the old hospital where the person was held, and a keeper would read it through and slowly nod, and arrangements would begin to be made for the long road up into Berkshire. there was a particular sort of cart kept ready for this grim work, a cart that was closed in on every side and fitted with no windows at all, so that the person shut up within it could not be seen by any soul they passed upon the road, and could not, in their turn, see the green and ordinary world that was sliding away from them forever. And in this dark and rocking and airless box they would be carried out through the loud and crowded streets of London, past the last of the tall houses and the lamplighters and the costermongers crying their wares, and the dostermongers crying their wares, and out into the wide and open country that lay beyond. The journey took the better part of a whole day. The roads grew steadily quieter, and the houses fewer and farther between, and the green land opened out wider on every side, and at the very last the cart would turn off the public way and onto a long private road that climbed up and up, through the dark pines toward the crest of the hill, the wheels grinding and crunching on the loose stones, where the great red front of the asylum stood waiting against the wide and indifferent sky, and the iron gate hung silent on its well oyagers, ready to swing. Chapter 3. The First to Arrive. And it was the women who would come first up that long road, for it was the women's range, the smaller and the separate building away to the east, that the builders had managed to finish soonest, and so it had been settled that the great asylum should open its iron gate to them before ever a single man set his foot inside it. In the late and rainy spring of the year the place first opened, while the gorse was still in its full yellow flower across the heath, and the warming earth gave up its green and growing smell to the damp air. The first of the closed and windowless carts came grinding up the long private road, and drew to a halt before the gate. And the great iron gate was drawn back upon its silent, well-oiled hinges, and the cart rolled slowly through it into the bare and clean-swept yard within, the iron-shod wheels crunching loud upon the raked gravel, and then the gate was shut again behind it, and the heavy bolts were slid home, one after another, with that dull and final sound of iron going into iron. Somewhere high up in the gatehouse tower, the new clock marked the passing hour, its single note rolling out flat across the empty heath. And down in the long cold shadow of the new red wall, the door of the cart was opened at last, and a woman was helped down, stiff and blinking, onto the grey gravel of the place that was to be her whole world for all the rest of her days upon the earth. She was the very first of them. That woman handed down from the cart in the wet spring of the asylum's first year, and the records that the doctors kept of her are thin and cold and few, as the records of poor women so very often are, telling us only the barest little of who she had been, and almost nothing at all of what she felt as she stood there on the gravel. They wrote down that she was weak and slow in her mind, and they used the hard, plain, clinical words of their trade, words that fall so cruelly on our ears now, but which were, to the men who wrote them, simply the ordinary language of medicine, and no unkindness meant. And what had brought her up the hill, what had set her name at the foot of a magistrate's order, and shut her up in the dark of that windowless cart for the long jolting road out of London, was the very worst thing that the law of that time saw brought before it, over and over and over and over again, the same dark shadow that would fill the female wards of that place almost to bursting in the first long months of its life. She'd killed her own child. I tell you this gently, here in the deep quiet of the night, because it is a hard and a heavy thing to hear, and because the cheap and easy way to tell it would be to make a wicked monster of her, and that I will not do, not for her, and not for any of the many women who came climbing up that hill after her, with the very same dark shadow written upon their papers. For to understand them at all you must first understand the lives that the poorer women led in that hard century, lives of grinding, endless labour and almost no rest, of one baby coming hard upon the heels of the last with never a pause between, of cold and crowded rooms and bare cupboards and husbands who drank away the week's wages, or who vanished, or who died young of the fever or the factory, leaving nothing behind. Theirs was a weariness that went down so deep into the very bone that the mind itself could give way and crack beneath the sheer weight of it. And after the long pain of the bearing of a child, some of these women fell into a terrible darkness that no one in that age yet understood, a black and crushing and bottomless despair, a sickness of the very spirit that the doctors had a name for, but no cure, and that could turn a gentle and a loving mother into someone who no longer knew her own thoughts from the whispers in the dark, who heard low voices in the long sleepless nights urging dreadful things upon her, who came at the very last to believe in the deepest pit of her mathematics that cat and it was in that broken and benighted state, in a single black hour of horror that they could almost never afterward remember clearly, that some of these poor women did the thing that brought them up the hill. The courts below had looked upon them, and had heard the doctors swear that their reason had altogether fled, and so they had handed down that strange new verdict that sent so many up the road that they were not guilty by reason of insanity, and had ordered them kept during the pleasure of the crown, and so they had been carried up to the women's range upon the lonely heath. And so it came to pass that for the first 9 long months of its life, this great and forbidding asylum, this place that had been raised and walled and bolted to hold the most dangerous and the most frightening people in all of England, held within it almost no one at all but grieving and broken-hearted mothers, women bowed right down to the ground by their sorrow and their shame, who shuffled along the new corridors with their eyes cast down upon the stone floor, and who wept softly in the long dark of the night for the differed Brangung, for the Den Gwardek, the men who had planned and run the place and braced themselves for raving violence, and had built every wall and hung every lock and filed down every fork against it, and instead they found themselves, to their own quiet bewilderment, the keepers of a great house of mourning, where the loudest sound to be heard in all the long grey evenings was the sound of a woman crying alone behind a bolted door. The women's range stood well apart from all the rest, away to the east of the great men's blocks, a closed and separate world of its own, behind its own inner walls, and it was here, among these sorrowful first arrivals, that the slow daily life of the whole asylum first took its lasting shape. The rooms were small and very plain, the most of them meant for a single soul alone, fitted with a narrow iron bedstead and its thin flock mattress and its pair of coarse grey blankets, and high up in the wall, far too high ever to be reached, a small window through which a single square of pale and changing Berkshire sky could be seen, but never touched. Some of the women, though, were not kept alone behind their own doors, but were lodged together in long dormitories, rows upon rows of the narrow iron beds beneath one high white ceiling, where in the deep dark a new arrival might lie awake and listen to the breathing and the murmuring and the soft helpless weeping of all the others ranged about her, and might take from it some small and bitter scrap of comfort in knowing that she was not, after all, the only one, and the nithe in hard fret and in it Dinglayton, and the wondered fawn grocery and brown stuff, and they would be led down in their slow shuffling rows to the dining hall where the long scrubbed deal tables stood, and there they would eat their morning meal, the thick grey porridge and the heavy bread and the weak and stab, from plates and bowls of metal, to short, plums and spoons, forks, it shorts a beard but a cuns, let me bring you in through the door now and set you down inside that female ward on an ordinary morning, for I want you to feel the very texture of it, the small dull weight of the slow hours as they pass one into another. There would be the cold grey light coming in, thin and slantwise at the high windows, and the sharp clean smell of carbolic soap fighting against the smell of boiled food and damp stone and too many bodies, and the steady sound of keys turning and doors swinging open, one after another, all the way down the long corridor. There would be the keepers themselves, the matrons, women hired and paid to watch over the patients, dressed in their dark plain gowns and their stiff white caps, walking the halls with their own great heavy rings of keys swinging and chinking at their belts, kind enough by the rough measure of the day, but always watchful, always counting under their breath, always near at hand. There would be the slow shuffle and scrape of many feet as the patients were moved from one place to the next, from the dormitory to the dining hall, from the dining hall to the workrooms, from the workrooms out at last into the bare-walled yard where they were let to walk their slow circles for an hour beneath the open and uncaring sky. And underneath it all, and over it all, there would be the quiet, the deep and settled institutional quiet of a place where nothing ever happened and nothing ever changed, a quiet broken only now and then by a sudden cry, or a fit of helpless sobbing, or the low and ceaseless voice of some woman in a corner, talking on, gently, to someone who was not there and never had been. For the doctors of that age believed, and it was perhaps the very kindest of all the things they believed, that idle hands and an empty mind were the deadliest enemies a troubled spirit could have, and that the surest road back toward health, if any road at all there was, lay through honest, useful, steady work and an unchanging daily round. And so the women were set to their labour, though it was not the cruel and pointless labour of the prisons, the turning of the useless crank handle and the endless picking apart of old tarred rope until the fingers bled, but rather the ordinary honest work of a great household, the very kind of work that the most of them had done with their hands all their lives. They sewed and they mended, and they cut and stitched the plain rough clothes that all the patients of the place wore. They laboured in the great steaming laundry, where the air hung thick and white with hot wet steam, washing and wringing and feeding the heavy wet sheets through the great mangles and pinning them out to dry, the endless sheets and shirts and gowns of so vast a household. They got down on their knees with brush and pail and scrubbed the long stone corridors until the floors shone wet and grey. Some worked in the great kitchens, peeling and chopping and stirring the iron coppers, their faces red and shining in the heat. And some, the calmer and the more trusted ones, were let out to work in the gardens within the walls, kneeling in the dark, rich Berkshire soil among the long straight rows of cabbages and beans, their bare hands buried in the cool brown earth, with the high blank wall always there at the very edge of their sight, a constant grey presence beyond the green. It was thought by the doctors that such honest work soothed and settled the troubled mind, and perhaps in truth it did, for there is a kind of quiet peace to be found in a task that asks nothing whatever of the aching heart but only the steady, repeated, mindless movement of the hands. And on the 7th day there was the chapel, for faith stood at the very centre of how that whole age understood the human soul and all its many sicknesses. And the men who ran the asylum believed, with all their hearts and without the smallest doubt, that a mind in the deepest torment might yet be reached and quieted, and perhaps even saved by the old and patient words of God. So upon the Sundays the women were led in their slow and shuffling rows into the plain stone chapel, and they sat down upon the hard wooden benches beneath the simple unadorned cross, and the chaplain stood up before them in his long black gown, and read out to them the old, old words of comfort and of judgement, the very same words that were being read aloud, that same hour in 10,000 parish churches the length and breadth of the land. Some of the women wept all the way through the whole of the service, quietly, without ever wiping their eyes. Some sat as still and grey and empty as carved stone, their eyes fixed upon nothing at all, lost somewhere far away inside themselves. And some of them, perhaps, found in those old and deeply familiar words a single moment of something very like rest, a brief and blessed loosening of the great hard knot of guilt and grief and madness that they carried about with them always. A faint sense that even here, even shut up behind these high red walls during the pleasure of a distant queen who would never know their names, they had not, after all, been entirely and forever cast out from the great mercy of heaven. The doctors moved among them all the while, watching and noting, writing down in their great leather ledgers the slow rise and the slow fall of each patient's state, whether she had eaten, whether she had slept, whether she had raved or sat quiet, whether the long, unchanging round of work and prayer and bare-walled walks seemed to be doing its slow, patient work upon her, or whether, instead, she was sinking deeper and deeper into the dark. They had so very few real remedies to call upon, those early doctors, for this was an age long before the medicines and the treatments that would come so much later, and the plain truth is that the most of what they had to offer was simply this, and nothing more: the clean, swept room, the plain, grey food, the daily labour, the deep quiet, and the slow passing of the time. For a small number of the women it was enough, or very nearly enough, and a few even grew well enough in their minds that the distant question of their release might one fine day be carefully raised, though release came rarely and slowly and grudgingly, and many a woman who might safely have gone home stayed on instead, year upon year, simply because there was no one left beyond the wall who would have her back. And for all the rest, the great and silent number of them, there was no going home, the 2010. The ball-eyed yard, the seasons wheeling slowly past the high small windows, grey to green and green again to grey, until at the very last their own quiet end came for them, and they were carried out through the small low go to the burying ground within the grounds, and laid down gently in the cold earth, with no stone raised up to mark, the placed cynthia, and the Paul de Bert the kind and the grim, fine sign then and the Fabonacus the Fatem. Chapter 4. Behind the iron gate, they came in the very dead of winter, the first of the men, up the long frozen road through the dark pines in the bitter cold of a Berkshire February, when the whole heath lay hard and white and silent beneath a low iron sky, and the breath of the straining cart horses rose and steamed in the freezing air. The closed and windowless carts came climbing up the hill one after another, all through those raw grey weeks, and through the great gate they rolled, and the heavy bolts slid home behind them, and down onto the iron-hard frozen gravel of the yard. The men were handed one by one, stiff and blinking in the thin, pale daylight after the long darkness of the journey, looking up for the first time at the high red walls that were to hold them now until the day they died. They were a very different cargo from the grieving and broken women who had come up before them, and the keepers knew it well and watched them all the more closely for it, and stood a little nearer to them, with their hands never far from the heavy keys at their belts. For among these men were some who had done things in the deepest grip of their madness that it is far better not to dwell upon here in the quiet of the night, things that had set whole crowded districts of London trembling behind their bolted doors and had filled the broadsheets in the penny papers with horror. And the men who had done them were strong, and a number of them were still dangerous, and the great mail blocks upon the very crest of the hill had been built thick and strong for exactly such as these. And yet I would ask you to hold fast in your mind, even now, even as the men of violence come climbing up the hill, the very thing we said together right at the beginning of all this, which is that this is not their story. Not truly, for the real and the lasting subject of this long tale is the great house itself, and the strange and terrible age that raised it, and not the small handful of broken men who merely happened to be carried up that road and shut away inside it. The age would dearly love to have us stand and stare at them. The killers and the madmen would have us press in close to look upon their faces and shudder at their deeds, but we will not give it the satisfaction, for they were only ever shadows passing through this place, here for a little while, and then gone down into the same cold earth as all the rest. The real and the enduring thing was the great unsleeping machine of the asylum itself, into which each man simply vanished, the vast and grinding order of locks and keys and bells and ledgers, and counted heads that closed silently around each one as the iron gate closed behind his cart, and swallowed him whole, and made of him nothing more than one further number in the long grey shuffling rows. It is that machine that I want to show you now, the slow and patient and unending daily round of life behind the iron gate, the very same for the worst of them as for the least, the same dull turning of the hour by hour, and the same wheeling of the asins year by year, until at the last the years themselves simply ran out. The day began long before the light and the cold and the black, with the sound of the keepers moving heavily down the long stone corridors, and the rattle and the grind and the turn of key after key and lock after lock. Each man slept alone in a small bare room, behind a stout wooden door fitted with a heavy iron bolt and a small round spy-hole, set at the height of a keeper's eye, through which a watching face might look in upon the sleeper at any hour of the night without his ever knowing, and in the cold morning that door was unbolted from without, and the man was let out into the corridor to begin another day exactly like the last. He rose up from his narrow iron bed, and from beneath his pair of coarse grey blankets, and he dressed himself in the plain rough clothes that the asylum gave out to every man alike, so that the gentleman born, and the common labourer, and the broken soldier, and the petty thief all wore the very same dull and shapeless cloth, and were, in their outward seeming, at the least, made equal one with another. He washed himself in cold water from a plain basin, the water sometimes skinned over with a thin grey ice in the dead of winter, and he made up his hard bed, and then he stood in his open doorway and waited, while up and down the whole length of the long echoing corridor the other doors were drawn open one after another, and the other men came shuffling out, and the keepers walked the rows and counted them. For the counting of heads was the one great unending labour of that whole place, the count at the first grey light of dawn, and the count again at the falling of the dusk, and the count once more at every shift and change of the long day, lest by some small miracle of patience and cunning a single man should have slicked his locks in the night, and gone up and over the high wall, and away down the dark hill into the sleeping and unsuspecting country far below. Then came the long slow procession to the dining hall, the men moving in their grey shuffling rows down the cold stewed tiles, in through the doors of the great room where the long scrubbed tables stood waiting, and there they ate the plain grey food of the house, the thick porridge, and the heavy grey bread and the weak milkless tea. And on Bedtime table forks and bowls of metal that could not be smashed, with those same short, blunt, stubby forks, who'd point stub, or it can be meant, all the time it's a bit of e-fit, and for them, their thummy, by what quated Eric, had harp. Now, the asylum, you see, had thought of everything, had reckoned up every danger that the mind of a careful man could imagine, and had built, or forged, or filed away quietly against it. For the men who ran the place lived always and everywhere with the cold knowledge of just what their charges had once done, and might yet do again if ever they were given the smallest chance, and so the whole of the great building, every window and a fork in it, had been shaped and ordered by a quiet and a fork in it, had been shaped and ordered by a quiet and a never sleep in fear. The windows were small and set deep, and crossed with stout iron bars or framed in unbreakable iron, so that no man could ever break out through the glass, and the high outer wall ran on unbroken all the way around, blank and smooth and far, far too tall for any man to climb, and the gravel that lay along the foot of it was raked clean and level, every single day, so that the print of any foot that ought not to be there would raked clean and level every single day, so that the print of any foot that ought not to be there would show up at once, plain and dark, in the morning. And after the morning meal there came the work, for here too, just as in the women's range away to the east, the doctors held fast and unshaken to their great belief that honest labour was the true and only healer of the troubled mind, that a man set to a useful task with his hands, kept busy, and his thoughts pinned hard upon the work in front of him, was a man drawn out, for a few blessed hours at least, from the dark and tangled country of his own madness. And so the men were led out to the workshops that stood behind the great central block, and there the whole asylum hummed and rang with the small honest industry of a dozen old trades. In one long room the tailors sat cross-legged upon their broad benches among the bolts of grey and brown cloth, their needles flashing, cutting and stitching the plain garments that the whole great house wore upon its back. In another the shoemakers bent low over their lasts, their mouths full of tacks, hammering and stitching with their waxed black thread, the stout and heavy boots that shod 1,000 shuffling feet. There were upholsterers stuffing and covering the hard mattresses and the plain chairs, and there were men set to mend and to make in wood and in iron, planing and sawing and filing, and out beyond the workshops, in the great kitchen gardens and the fields within the grounds, whole gangs of patients laboured under the unders, whole gangs of patients laboured under the open Berkshire sky, digging and planting and weeping the crops that helped to feed the place, their spades rising and falling and rising, in the dark wet soil, with the high grey walls standing, always there at the very edge of the work. A man who had once in his other life been a craftsman or a tradesman might find in this work a small lost shred of his old self come back to him, might lose himself for an hour together in the deep and familiar movements of his old trade, his hands remembering what his broken mind had half forgotten, and the doctors watched closely for exactly that, and noted it down in their ledgers, and counted it a small and quiet victory whenever a violent man grew settled and steady and calm over a patient task. Let me set you down for a moment, now in one of those long winter afternoons, so that you may feel for yourself just how the time moved within that place, slow and thick and heavy as the low grey light itself. Picture the tailor's workroom, warm and close from a small coal fire burning low in its iron grate, the air hung thick with the smell of wool and oil and warm bodies, the only sounds in all the room, the snip and bite of the great iron shears and the steady whisper of the thread drawn through the cloth, and the low murmur of a keeper's voice somewhere by the door, And picture, at one of the benches a little apart from the rest, a man with fine and careful and clever hands, working away quietly at his cloth, as patient and as mild as any clerk bent over his ledgers, a man you might have passed 100 times in any street in England, and never once turned your head to look at twice, and yet a man, whose name, were I to speak it aloud here in the dark, might call up some old and half-forgotten horror from the very depths of the age. He does not look like a horror now. He looks like a tired and greying man sewing quietly in the failing winter light. And that, you see, is the strange and the sobering truth of the whole place, the thing that the penny papers never told, that the monsters the broadsheets had made of these men simply dissolved away, behind the iron gate, into ordinary, weary, ageing creatures, eating their grey porridge and stitching their cloth and shuffling along to chapel, growing slowly grey and stooped, and old in the long, slow grinding of the identical days, until at the last you could scarcely bring yourself to believe that these quiet, shuffling-seeming figures had ever once saved the whole grinding of the doors at all. And on the Sundays, here, just as in the women's range, there was the chapel, and the men were led in their long grey rows to sit down upon the hard wooden benches beneath the plain and unadorned cross, and the chaplain in his black gown read out to them the old, old words, and they bowed their heads, the gentle and the violent together, the harmless and the terrible side by side upon the same hard bench, all of them made equal at the last in the eyes of the faith that the age held to be the one shore of the soul. Some among them sat empty and far away, their eyes fixed upon nothing, lost in whatever dark country their minds had wandered off into and could not find the road back from. Some wept, silently, the tears running down without a sound, and some moved their lips over the words of the old hymns they had learned at their mother's knees a whole lifetime ago, in another world, before ever the sickness came down upon them, before the deed, before the cart and the gate and the high wall. The chaplain looked out over the whole strange grey congregation and did his patient best to reach them, and the keepers stood ranged along the walls and by the doors, with their keys. And outside the tall chapel windows the slow Berkshire rain came down upon the heath, and high up in the gatehouse tower the bell tolled out the slow and even procession of the hours, on and on over the long red ranges and the bare-walled yards, and the rain drowned down the glass. And a man somewhere near the back went very quietly, mithing the words of Peredogavite. Chapter 5. The painter in the ward of all the lost and sorrowing souls who were carried up that long road to the hill in those first hard years. Let me tell you now of one who came not with a weapon held in his hand, but with a paintbrush, for his is perhaps the strangest and the most heartbreaking of all the tales that the place ever gathered to itself. He was a painter, and not a poor or a middling one either, but a man who had once been called by people who knew, the most brilliant young artist of his whole generation, a man whose pictures had hung where the great and the fashionable and the learned could stand before them and marvel, before the darkness ever came creeping down upon his mind and swept the whole bright and promising world of his youth clean away. And to understand how such a man, so gifted and so admired, came at the last to be shut up behind the high red walls upon the lonely heath, you must come back with me a little while, away from the asylum and its locks and its bells, to the London of his early days, when he was young and full of his early days, when he was young and full of his gift, and the whole of the future seemed to lie open before him, like a clear white road stretching away in the bright morning light. He had been born down in the green county of Kent, the son of a chemist, a maker and seller of medicines and oils and powders, and from his very earliest boyhood his hand had been quick and sure and certain with a pencil, so that everyone about him saw at once that here was a gift quite out of the common run of things. He went up to the great art school in the capital while he was still a very young man, and there he won a medal for the fineness of his drawing, and he drew about him a little band of other bright and hopeful young painters, who gave themselves a name and sat up late together in their lodgings, dreaming aloud of all the great and lasting works that they would one day make. He painted scenes drawn out of the old plays and the old fairy tales, painted moonlit woods and dancing fairies and strange enchanted glades, and all of it was done with a patience so fine and so close and so loving that you could lean your face right in toward the canvas and lose yourself entirely among 100 tiny figures, each one no larger than your fingernail, every blade of grass and every gauzy wing picked out with a care that seemed almost more than human. The world looked upon his work and praised it warmly, and the great and weighty men of the art world marked him out among all the others for a coming greatness. And had you chanced to meet him in those days, you would never in your wildest fancy have dreamed of the dark road that was waiting, all unseen, just ahead of him. The great change came over him after a long journey. A wealthy gentleman had engaged the gifted young painter to travel with him as his companion and his artist, far away across the seas to the old and burning lands of the East, to Greece and to Egypt and the ancient countries that lay along the great slow rivers. And there the painter filled sketchbook after sketchbook with all the wonders that he saw. But somewhere upon that long and wearying road, beneath the hard white hammer of the foreign sun, something deep within his mind began, very quietly, to give way. He grew strange and troubled and full of a nameless fear. He came to believe that he was watched, that he was followed and hunted by unseen and malevolent powers, that secret messages were being sent to him out of the old dark gods of ancient Egypt, and that one of those ancient and terrible gods had marked him out from all other men, and spoke to him in the silence, and laid commands upon him that no other living soul could hear. He came home to England at the last a wholly changed man, restless and watchful and full of dread, his eyes forever fixed upon things that were not there, and his family looked upon him with a slow and growing horror, for they could not understand the sickness that had come down upon their gifted and gentle boy, and there was no one in all that age who truly could have understood it, for the knowledge simply did not yet exist. And then, one warm evening in the late summer, in the deepest grip of his terrible delusion, the painter did the thing that brought him at the last to the hill, a thing so dreadful that I will set it down here only plainly and simply, and then pass on, for we did not climb up here together tonight to dwell and gloat upon the deed, but to follow the strange long afterlife of the man who did it. He had come to believe in the very pit of his madness, that his own father, who loved him and who had cared for him in his sickness, was not his father at all, but was instead the devil himself, walking the green earth in a stolen human shape. And one quiet evening, as the two of them walked together among the trees of a park down in Kent, the son turned upon the father and killed him. And then he fled across the narrow sea to France, his mind still wholly aflame with its phantoms, and upon the road there he fell upon and tried to harm a stranger in a coach, before he was at last overpowered and seized and held. He spent some months shut away in a French madhouse, and then he was brought back home to England, and the courts looked upon him and saw plainly that his reason had altogether and entirely fled, and so he was committed, as such men then were, to the criminal wing of that ancient and famous old hospital in the heart of London, the place whose very name had long since worn down into a byword for madness and uproar itself. And there he stayed for 20 long years, behind the locked doors of those old criminal wards. And here now is the strange and the tender thing that I most want you to take hold of and to keep, for in that grim and ancient place the painter did not stop his painting. The doctors who kept him there, men whose names truly deserve to be remembered kindly for it, looked upon their strange and gifted prisoner and chose not to take his brushes away from him, but gave him paints and canvas and the quiet leave to go on working, for they had seen, perhaps, that the only peace the poor tormented man ever found in all his long days was in the slow and patient and absorbing labour of his art. And so it was that, in a small barred room in the heart of that gloomy hospital, a man whom the whole world had locked away and forgotten as a murderer and a lunatic sat, year upon patient year, and made some of the most beautiful and haunting and unearthly pictures that the whole long century would ever see. He painted his fairies and his enchanted woods still, as he always had. But now there was a deeper and a stranger quality woven all through them, a crowding, dreamlike, almost airless quality, as though each small canvas were a little window opening straight into the very country where his own troubled mind now wandered without rest. One picture above all he laboured over for 9 long years together, a small and crowded and shadowed wood, thick with more than 100 tiny figures, every one of them painted with a patience so unearthly and so exact that men still stand before it to this day and wonder, quietly, at the broken mind that could ever have made such a thing. Now I want you to picture in your mind the day, in the very year that the new asylum upon the Heath first swung open its iron gate, when the order at last came down that the painter was to be moved. He was no longer a young man at all by then, but greying and worn and aged before his time, and for 20 long years he had not once set his foot outside the walls of that old hospital, had not seen a green field, nor a hedgerow, nor the wide open sky arching over open country. And then one morning he was taken out through the gates and put aboard a train, and the train pulled away and carried him out of the great grey smoke of London and into the green and rolling country of Berkshire, and the painter, who had not laid eyes upon the free and ordinary world in 2 whole decades, sat at the carriage window and watched, in silence, as the fields and the woods and the little wayside stations went sliding and streaming by. The train climbed up at the last toward the hill, and the closed cart was waiting there to meet it, and he was carried up the long private road through the dark pines to the great red house upon the heath, and the iron gate was drawn back, and he passed in through it to the place where he would spend all the rest of his days upon the earth. And here, if anything at all, his hard life grew a little gentler than it had been before. For the men who ran the new asylum held fast to that very same belief, that honest work was the great healer of a broken mind, and they soon saw clearly what manner of rare and gifted man had been delivered up to them, and they set his strange gift to good and steady use. They gave him a studio of his very own at the last, a thing he had never once had in all his long years of confinement, and they set him to decorate the bare walls of the great hall where the patients gathered together, and to paint the scenery for the little plays and entertainments that were got up to lighten the long dark evenings of the place. And so the painter, in his old age, became the asylum's own artist, and he covered its plain walls with whole fantastical lambs, with painted seas and painted mountains and golden cities that stood and shone nowhere on this earth, but only in the strange and glittering country of his own clouded mind. He painted, too, the small and quiet things that lay close at hand, for there was a great kitchen garden within the walls, many acres of dark-turned Berkshire earth, where the patients grew the food the whole place lived upon, and the painter would gather up the simple, humble fruits of that garden, the gooseberries and the red currants and the green spring onions and a single curling gherkin, and arrange them upon a cloth with a tender and a prose and a grinans, and the single curling gherkin, and arrange them upon a cloth with a tender and a produce of an asylum's garden, was betate, would come behired, and it's a dard to him court for he had it. And once he even painted the view from within the grounds itself, the low wooded plain that then stretched away all around the lonely hill, the only such landscape he ever made of the world that lay actually before his eyes. He grew old within those walls, very old. The long years of his confinement aged him cruelly and before his time, and one year a foul sickness of the gut swept through the whole crowded place, carried in upon the bad and tainted water of the hill, and the painter took it, as so many did, and never wholly mended himself after. His fine hand grew slower upon the brush. His sharp eyes grew dim and clouded, and in his last winter a slow wasting sickness of the lungs settled down upon his chest, the old patient killer of that age, and he failed by slow degrees as the cold dark months drew in around him, until at the very last, in the first black days of a new January, the painter died, an old man of 68 years, in the asylum that had been his whole world for the last and the longest part of his life. They buried him in the small burying ground within the grounds, among the other forgotten and unstoned dead of the place, and no great monument was ever raised up over him, and the art world that had once called him the very brightest of his generation had long ago let his name slip quietly down into the dark. His brushes were gathered up and washed and put away in their box. His paints were stoppered, and outside the window of the small studio where he had worked for so long, the deep winter frost crept slowly and silently across the cold panes of glass, white and fine and feathered, spreading its pale ferns and forests over the dark, looking out, as it always had, upon the long kitchen garden lying bare and brown and frozen below. Chapter 6. The Surgeon's Books. The garden lay quiet and frozen under that creeping frost, and the great asylum went on with its slow business, season after grey season, taking in its strange and sorrowing arrivals one by one as the courts below sent them up. And not so very many years after the old painter had first come up the hill, another man was carried in through the iron gate, whose story would prove very nearly as strange as his, though it ran in a wholly different direction and toward a wholly different end. This one came from very far away, from across the great western ocean, and he had been, in his time, a man of real learning and of healing, a doctor, a surgeon, who had cut and stitched and mended and saved the lives of men upon the dreadful battlefields of a terrible foreign war. And to find the deep root of his madness, he must go back, just as we did with the painter, away from the hill and into the man's own past, back to a great and bloody war that was fought long ago and far away, among the smoke and the cannon and the screaming and the dying. He had been born upon a hot green island on the very far side of the world, the son of church folk who had gone out from their cold northern country to carry their faith to distant heathen lands, and he had been sent back home as a boy to the country of his fathers across the sea, and there he had grown up clever and bookish and gentle and mild, and had studied hard at a great college, and had become, in time, a doctor. And then his own country fell suddenly into a vast and a bloody war within its own borders, brother turning his gun upon brother, and the young doctor was sent off to tend the wounded, and there he stood, day after day, among scenes of such horror as no gentle and bookish mind could ever afterward wholly leave behind it. There is a dark story told of one particular and dreadful duty that was laid upon him in that war, that he was ordered to burn a mark with a hot iron into the very face of a young deserter, a frightened soldier, little more than a boy, who had run away from the fighting, and that the memory of that one act and of that boy's face fastened itself upon the doctor's mind ever after, like a barbed hook sunk deep into the flesh, and would not be shaken loose. Whatever the true and tangled root of it may really have been, the doctor came out of that war at the last, a hollow and a haunted man. He began to believe that he was followed wherever he went, that men crept into his rooms in the dead of night to do him some secret harm, that hidden enemies pursued him without rest across the whole face of the world. And so, broken in his nerves and pensioned off by his grateful army, he came at the last to England, hoping, as so many troubled souls have hoped, that a change of country and of scene might somehow quiet the terrors that raged inside his own head. But it did not quiet them, for the terrors a man carries within him are not so easily left behind upon a far shore. He took cheap lodgings in a poor and crowded riverside quarter of London, down among the wharves and the breweries and the river fog, and there the old delusions closed in upon him, worse and tighter than ever they had before, until he was barricading his door with his furniture every night against the men he was utterly certain came creeping to torment him in the dark. And one black winter morning, in the small and bitter hours long before the dawn, the doctor took up a loaded pistol and went out into the empty lamplit street, his mind wholly aflame with the burning certainty that one of his many persecutors was upon him at last. And ere, in the cold and the dark, he came upon a poor working man hurrying along to his early shift at the brewery, an honest labourer named George Merritt, a husband and the loving father of a whole houseful of young, with yet another child on the way. And the doctor, seeing in this innocent and hurrying stranger one of the cruel phantoms that hunted him through his nights, raised up his pistol and shot the man dead there in the open street. It was the very cruellest of all chance meetings, the collision of a sick man's waking nightmare with a good man's ordinary working morning, and in a single instant a faithful wife was made a widow, and the whole brood of children made fatherless, for no reason on this earth that the sane and waking world could ever afterward make the smallest sense of. The courts looked long upon the doctor, and heard the testimony of all those who had known and marked how strangely and how fearfully he had been behaving, and they saw plainly that his reason had given way beneath him, and so they handed down that same strange verdict that had sent so many others up the long road to the hill, that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, and they ordered him kept during the pleasure of the crown, and in the spring he too was carried up to the asylum upon the Heath. And here, now, his story turned sharply away from all the others that we have followed, for this doctor was not a poor man, as the most of those who came in through that gate were poor. He had his army pension still, paid faithfully to him across the ocean every quarter, and the keepers did not judge him to be a danger to the other patients, and so he was given quarters of a comfort that very few souls inside those high walls would ever know. He was allowed the use of 2 rooms, and he filled them, slowly, with books. He wrote away to the booksellers of London and had them send him up crate after wooden crate of old and rare and precious volumes, until one of his 2 rooms became a kind of private library, the shelves climbing the walls and crowded thick with the gathered learning of whole centuries, there, in a cell upon a lonely Berkshire hill, behind the high red wall, watched over by the keepers and their keys. And it was among those crowded shelves, in the quiet of his strange comfortable cell, that the doctor found, if not his cure, for there was no cure, then at the very least his salvation, the one great and patient labour that gave the long and broken remainder of his years a shape and a meaning. For far away in another city altogether, a small band of learned and patient men had set out upon a vast and daunting task, the making of a great dictionary that would gather up between its covers every single word in the whole of the English tongue, and would trace each one of them back and back through the long centuries to show exactly how it had been used down the years, and how its meaning had shifted and narrowed and grown. It was a labour far too great and too endless for any small handful of men to accomplish alone, and so the great editor of the work had sent out a printed appeal, far and wide across the whole land, asking ordinary readers everywhere, in their own homes, to comb patiently through their books and to copy out for him every sentence in which an interesting word appeared, so that the whole long history of the living language might be built up, one little paper slip at a time, from the willing hands of 10,000 unknown helpers. And the lonely doctor in his cell upon the hill, with his crowded shelves all about him, and his endless empty hours stretching away before him, read that printed appeal, and answered it, and bent himself to the work with a fierce and a steady and an unwearying devotion that he had found for nothing else in all his ruined life. And so began one of the very strangest labours in all the long history of letters. Day after day, and year after patient year, the doctor sat among his beloved books in the deep quiet of the asylum, and hunted through the old yellowed pages for his words, and copied out his chosen sentences in a fine clear hand upon little slips of paper, and gathered them up, and tied them in bundles, and sent them off through the post to the great work being made so far away. And his slips were so many, and so carefully and so cleverly done, that he became in time one of the most valued and most trusted readers that the whole vast undertaking ever had upon its books, sending in his thousands upon thousands of quotations, more very nearly than any other single soul who ever lent a hand to the making of that great work. And here is the strangest turn of all, for through the most of those long years the great editor far away had not the faintest notion of who his most faithful and most prolific helper truly was, for the little slips came always from an address that gave nothing whatever away, and the editor supposed his learned and tireless correspondent to be some gentleman doctor attached to the place, a man of leisure with a fine library, and never once dreamed, in all that time, that the man was himself a patient, a man lucked away for a killing done in the black that mat. And when at the very last the truth of it did come out, and the astonished editor made the long journey up to the hill himself to meet and to thank this strange and generous helper who had given so very much, the two men met and looked upon one another, and far from turning away in horror, the editor took the broken doctor's hand in his own, and out of that meeting there grew a true and a lasting friendship between the two of them that endured down all the years that followed. There was a deep and a quiet tenderness, too, in another corner of the doctor's strange and broken life, for he never once forgot the man he had killed in the street that dark morning, nor the family he had robbed of its father and its bread. Out of his own pension he sent money, faithfully, to the poor widow, to ease a little the want that his own mad act had brought down upon her and her children, and in time, by some great and almost unbelievable grace of the human heart, the widow herself came up to the asylum to visit the very man who had made her a widow, and she brought him books for his great work, and a strange kind of peace, past all understanding, passed quietly between the two of them. But the doctor's own mind never truly healed, for there was no healing it, and as he grew older, the old terrors crept back upon him worse and darker than ever. The phantoms in the night and the black certainties, until in one fearful and terrible year, in the grip of a delusion too cruel and too sad to dwell upon, he did himself a grievous and a lasting harm with the very knife that he kept for his patient work upon the books. After that he failed, in his body and in his mind together, and at the last, when he had grown very old and very broken, and there seemed no danger left in him at all, the high men of the government signed the order that set him free. He was a very old man by then, white-haired and bent. They put him aboard a great ship to carry him home at last across the wide ocean to the land of his fathers, and he gathered up the first great finished volumes of the very dictionary he had given so much of his life and his reason to help make, and he carried them with him, held close, up onto the deck. The ship cast off, and pulled slowly away from the English shore, and the grey water widened, foot by foot, between the rail and the land, and far behind him, far inland and long out of his sight. Up on the quiet hill, the great ring of his keys was hung up once more upon the board, and in the emptied room where his thousands of books had stood for so long in their crowded rows, the dust turned slowly, round and round, in a single long bar of pale afternoon, light slanting in the high-barred weald, the hinting in the high-barred wind. Chapter 7. Shots at the crown, that pale and slanting light fell, season after turning season, year upon long year, upon a place that held within its high walls not only the broken and the grieving and the strange, but also a small and singular and most particular company of men, whose madness had carried them up against their neighbours or their families, but against the very highest personage in all the land, against the sacred person of the crown itself, against the very highest personage in all the land, against the sacred person of the crown itself, against the ferried as the wigga. For this was the great and confident age of the empire, when the small, aging woman who sat upon the throne was the most powerful sovereign in all the wide world, the mother of a vast family of nations spread across every sea, her stern face stamped upon the coin in every labourer's pocket, and her name spoken in every prayer in every church, and to raise a hand against her royal person was held to be the very blackest and most unforgivable crime that the whole long law of the kingdom could name, a crime that bore the ancient and terrible names of dark.Knife, and at foot cricraged such fit fight to it. And yet, again and again across the long decades of her great reign, troubled and broken men did indeed raise their hands against her, and when they did, and when the courts looked upon them and found that their minds were sick and not sound, it was up to the hill, up to the lonely asylum upon the heath, that these would-be killers of the Queen were quietly and secretly carried away, out of the sight and out of the memory of the watching world. Let me take you first to a bright June day in London, many a long year before ever the asylum upon the heath was so much as thought of or planned, when the Queen herself was young and newly wed, and rode out in an open carriage with her young husband seated close beside her, along a wide and pleasant tree-lined road beneath the warm summer sky. The crowds had gathered along the way to see her pass by, as the crowds always did and always would, and there among them, pressed in with all the rest, stood a young man, hardly more than a boy, in truth, a pot-boy from the public houses of the city, a restless and a strange and an idle youth, full of grand and foolish and swollen dreams of his own great importance in the world. And as the royal carriage came rolling slowly by him, this youth stepped forward out of the crowd and drew out 2 pistols, one in each hand, and fired them, the one after the other, full and direct at the young queen and at the husband at her side. By some very great mercy of heaven, neither shot found its mark, nor did any harm, and the carriage rolled steadily on unharmed, and the boy was seized at once and dragged down by the hands of the furious crowd all around him. They charged him with high treason, the gravest charge the law possessed, and at his trial the doctors stood up and swore that his mind was not sound, that there was a taint and a strain of madness running in his very blood, and the jury, after much confusion, found at the last that he was not to be punished as a common and knowing traitor would be punished, but was to be shut away as a lunatic during the pleasure of the crown. And so he was carried off and shut away, first in that old hospital in London, and then, when at last the new asylum upon the hill was opened and ready, he was among the very earliest of the men to be carried up to it, in its first cold months. And here now is a thing well worth our pausing over for a moment, in the quiet, for the boy who had fired upon his queen turned out, once he was safely shut away behind the walls, to be no raving and dangerous monster at all, but a quiet and a clever and a biddable fellow, who set himself to learning with a will and a patience that astonished all who watched him. In all his long years of confinement he taught himself trade after honest trade and tongue after foreign tongue, until he could read and speak in the languages of half the countries of Europe, and he became a steady, useful, well-mannered and well-liked man about the place, so much so that those who kept and watched him came in time to doubt, privately, whether he had ever truly been mad at all, or whether he had only ever been a foolish and a friendless and a fatherless boy who had once done a single wild and terrible thing and paid for it, since with the halt the bow. And in the end the men of the government came to decide that he was no longer the least danger to anyone living, and they offered him his freedom at the last, but only upon one single hard, unbending condition, that he must leave the country of his birth forever, and sail away and never once set his foot upon English soil again, so long as he should live. And he took the hard bargain that was offered him, under a new and a borrowed name that gave away nothing of who he had been. He sailed away across the world to the new lands far in the south, and there, an ordinary and an unremarkable man at the last, among people who knew nothing whatever of his strange and dreadful past, he lived out a long and a quiet and a respectable life, and worked at his trade, and grew old in peace, and died at the last full of years, far from the hill and the hoy-boy with the 2 pistols that he had once been. But not all of them, by any means, ever found such a road as that one out from behind the walls, and let me carry you forward now, through the years, to a grey and blustery afternoon, at a railway station in the shadow of one of the Queen's own great castles, when she was no longer the young bride of that bright June day, but an old woman, dressed all in deep black, long widowed, with the great weight of half a century of rule and of sorrow bowing down her shoulders. Her royal train had come into the platform, and she had been helped down and had crossed the platform toward her waiting carriage, when of a sudden a shabby, wretched, ill-looking man stepped out from among the people gathered in the station-yard, a man plainly down upon his luck, an out-of-work clerk with a head full of bitter grievance and dark delusion, and he raised up a revolver and fired it straight at the old Queen. But by the greatest of good fortune there were schoolboys near at hand, a knot of lads from the famous old school that stood close by the castle, and quick as a darting thought one of these boys struck out at the wretched man with his furled umbrella, and knocked his aim awry before ever he could draw the trigger a second time, and the Queen was bundled away unhurt, and the man was seized and held. And at his trial the jury took only a very few short minutes to find that he too was insane, and he was sent up the long road to the asylum upon the Heath, where he would remain for the whole of the rest of his long and friendless life, an old and a forgotten man among all the other old and forgotten men, dying behind the walls at last very nearly 40 years after the day he had raised his pistol in that windy station-yard. But this last shot, harmless though it proved to be, set running something that reached out far beyond the wretched man who fired it, and I would have you mark it well, for it shows, better than almost anything, how the strange doings inside that one lonely asylum could reach out their hand and alter the very law of the whole wide land. For the old queen was deeply and bitterly angered by the verdict that her would-be killer was found to be insane, since it galled her sorely that a man who had pointed a loaded pistol straight at his own anointed sovereign and pulled upon the trigger should be sent away found, in the words of the court, not guilty of anything at all, however mad the doctors might swear him to be, and she let her royal displeasure be known in no uncertain terms to her ministers of state, and she pressed them hard to change the law of the land, so that a man found mad in such a case as this should not be sent away called innocent, but should rather be called guilty, and guilty plainly, even while being judged at the same time to be insane. And the ministers heard their angry queen, and they bent her will, and the law was duly altered to her wish, so that ever after, in such cases as these, the strange and double verdict ran the other way about, naming the man guilty first, and mad only second. It was a small change in the bare words of the law, a matter of the turning around of a phrase, and yet it had been driven through and made real by nothing more nor less than an old queen's hot anger at a madman's wild and wasted bullet, and it stood there, written into the law books of the kingdom, for long generations of men to come. And so the asylum upon the heath became, among all its many other heavy burdens, the silent keeper of the empire's most secret and most carefully guarded fears. For a great and a proud and an outwardly confident age, an age that dearly loved to think of itself as the very master of the whole round world, could not easily bear to look full upon the hard and frightening truth that its own mighty and beloved sovereign might be shot at, in the broad open street, by any broken and friendless man who happened to lay his hands upon a pistol and to carry a head full of phantoms. And so these men, every one of them, were quietly gathered up and carried far away to the hill, where the comfortable gweld need deaf trouble biddy tup tup the themper thank kind of fem that the beginning of them. They were not put to death upon the scaffold, for the law had looked at them and found them mad. They were not set free to walk among their fellows, for the danger that was in them, whether it was real or whether it was only imagined, could never be safely risked, and so instead they were simply folded away quietly into the long, grey, unchanging life of the place, along with all the others, the grieving mothers and the haunted painter and the gentle doctor with his crowded shelves of books, all of them made equal at the last, behind Ride Wall. And among that strange and silent company in those early years, there had come up the long road from London yet another man whose name the lawyers of the whole age knew well, a quiet northern wood-turner whose own dark deed, done years before in a London street, had given the very courts of England the rule by which all these others were now weighed and judged and found to be mad, and who lived out only a very little while upon the hill before his own end came quietly for him. Night would come down at the last over the wide heath, as it always did and always must, and the great red house would settle slowly into its deep darkness, and the gas lamps would be lit one by one along the length of the long stone corridors, throwing their small pools of yellow light, and the keepers would walk their last slow rounds of the evening, and turn their heavy keys in the heavy locks, and count their silent heads one final time before the great quiet of the small hours came down and closed over everything. And somewhere within that vast and sleeping building, in one of the small barred rod Rhine, in the thinks, Timmy Cuisinite through the iron bars across the black and silent miles of the sleeping country, and far off, away on the very edge of the darkness, the few scattered lights of the distant town where it had all begun for him, would glimmer faintly for a moment through the swaying tops of the pines, small and cold and impossibly far away, and then the far lights would abade of cold, and the brothate that had the good would add better. Chapter 8. The Bell That Warns the Living Beyond the High Red Wall. All through those long and turning years, the world had not stood still and waited, for while the asylum kept its silent and sorrowful company of the lost, the wide country lying all around it had slowly and steadily filled up with the living. The lonely heath that had once belonged to nothing but the rabbits and the gorse and the kestrels was lonely no longer, for the little railway had brought people up out of the city, and the people had built their houses, and where there had once been only the open and empty moor, there were now quiet leafy roads, and trim gardens, and schools with their playgrounds, and small comfortable towns had grown up all around the foot of the hill, with their plain English names, Crothcorn and Sandhurst and Wokingham and Bracknell, settled and respectable plays lived out order American and Drundlarbleaves. and these families lived, whether or not they ever cared to speak openly of it, in the long shadow of the great house upon the ridge above them. For every single soul in those towns knew very well what it was that stood up there behind the dark line of the pines, knew that just over the wall, close enough to walk to of an afternoon, were gathered together some of the most troubled and most dangerous people in all the land. For the most part, year upon year, the wall held them fast, and the towns slept easy and untroubled in their beds, and the asylum was simply one more fixed and accepted fact of the landscape, like the weather and the pines and the chiming of the church clock. But every so often, down the long years, a man would somehow find a way to slip his locks and go up and over the wall and out into the free world, and then a cold and an ancient fear would come running through those quiet streets below, the oldest fear of all, the fear of what dreadful thing might now be loose and moving among them in the dark. Let me carry you forward now, across a great many years, away from the gaslight and the gloom and the Victorian fog of the early days, and into a later and a brighter age, to a grey spring afternoon long after the asylum was first built and filled, when the towns below the hill were full of motor cars and crackling wireless sets, and the children rode their bicycles up and down the quiet lanes, and the whole hard memory of the place's beginnings had faded to an old grey story. On that ordinary afternoon, a patient up at the asylum was set to his work at the cleaning, as the patients so often were, and somewhere in the course of that work he found himself, for a few short and unwatched minutes, quite alone, and he saw, in those few minutes, his one chance. He climbed up onto the sloping roof of a low outbuilding that stood hard against the great outer wall, scrambling and slipping in his heavy boots, and he hauled himself up the slates and over the very top of the wall, and he dropped down the far side of it into the free and open world beyond, and he simply walked away, down the hill and out across the country. He was loose for only a few short hours before the police ran him to ground and brought him back behind the walls. But a few short hours, as it proved, were enough, and more than enough, for in that small space of stolen time, in a quiet village not so very far off, he came upon a little girl, a child of just 5 years old, out riding her brand-new bicycle in the lanes near her own home on an ordinary and a sunlit afternoon, and the man who had come down off the hill took her young life from her. It was the very thing, the precise and particular thing, that the towns below had always quietly dreaded, the old nightmare made suddenly and terribly real. A child lost to a danger that had come walking down off the hill above them, and when the news of it spread through those quiet streets, the settled peace of those leafy Berkshire suburbs turned, in a single day, to grief, and then to a hard and a rising anger, and the people would not stand for it, and nor can we wonder that they would not. They gathered together, and they held their meetings, and they demanded loudly to be told how such a man could ever have gone up and over the wall so very easily, and they asked again and again how a mother in any one of those villages was ever to close her eyes and feel safe again, knowing what manner of men sat upon the hill above her sleeping children. The government, pressed hard on every side, held a full and a searching inquiry into the whole sorry and shameful business, and out of that long inquiry there came at the last a strange and a lasting answer, a thing that would come to mark those towns and shape the lives within them for the rest of that century and far beyond it. For it was decided, in the end, that if the high wall could not be trusted to hold every man every time, then at the very least the people living below must be warned, and warned swiftly and surely and at once, the very instant that a dangerous man got himself loose, so that the mothers might gather up their children indoors and lock fast their doors before ever the danger could come near them. And so they resolved to give the silent asylum, at the last, a voice of its own. They raised up great sirens upon tall masts all across the whole wide district, a whole network of them, set out and scattered through the towns and the villages for miles around the foot of the hill, and they wired every one of them back to the asylum, so that the moment a man was found to be missing from his count, the alarm could be raised and the great warning sent howling and wailing out across all the miles of the sleeping land. And the sound that they chose to give it was a sound that the whole country already knew and already feared deep in its bones, for it was the very same sound that had wailed out over the darkened cities in the black years of the last great war, the rising and the falling cry of the air raid siren, the dreadful note that had once sent whole streets of people running and stumbling for the shelters as the enemy bombers droned in over the rooftops. And now that very same terrible note was given to the hill, so that whenever the asylum should cry out, it would cry out in the old remembered voice of wartime dread itself. A long, slow, alternating wail of high and low that rolled out over the rooftops and the gardens and the schoolyards, and could never, once heard, be mistaken for any other sound on the whole earth. And the people of those quiet towns learned, carefully, what they must do whenever they should hear it. The schools drew up their own solemn plans and procedures, and the teachers were told and drilled that the very instant the siren began to wail, they must bring every last child in off the playground and indoors, and lock the doors fast, and let no boy or girl out of their direct sight for a single moment, and count their charges, and search the lanes and the cloakrooms, and keep them all safe gathered within until the danger had well and truly passed. The roads would be thrown across with blocks, and the police would stop and search every passing car, and a great tightening net would be drawn close around the whole of the district, and all of it, every part of it, set running and set in motion by that one single rising wail from the hill. But the great trouble with any such warning is that no living soul can ever be quite sure that it truly works, and that everyone still knows it, unless from time to time it is sounded and tried, and so the keepers of the asylum settled at the last upon a fixed and a regular custom, a thing that would come to shape the daily lives of every man, woman and child who lived within the long sound of the hill for whole generations to come. Once in every week, upon one fixed and chosen morning, they would sound out all the sirens together, on purpose and by plan, not because any man at all was loose, but simply and only to make certain, week by week, that the great voice still worked, and that the people below still knew it and still feared it. And so it came to pass that every single Monday morning at 10 o'clock exactly, neither a minute before it nor a minute after, the old air-raid wail would rise up out of the heath and roll out across all the leafy Berkshire towns, the very same dread note that meant a dangerous man was loose and abroad among them, only this time meaning nothing at all. This one time meaning only a test and a trial of the thing. For 2 long minutes together the siren would climb and fall and climb again, filling the whole bright morning with its wartime cry, rattling the window panes in their frames and stilling, for a moment, the talk in the shops and the streets, and then it would die slowly away into silence, and a few minutes after that a second note would sound out, a single, steady, unwavering tone this time, the all-clear, the note that danger had passed, and that ordinary life might safely take up its course once. I would have you stop and think, for one quiet moment, of what it must truly have been to grow up as a child in one of those towns, in all the long decades after the bell was first given its terrible voice, for whole generations of boys and girls were born and were raised there, who had never once in all their lives known a single Monday morning without it. To those children it was simply a part of the ordinary world, as fixed and as unremarkable as the ringing of the church bells on a Sunday or the rattle of the milk float at dawn. The great wail that came every week at 10, and that everyone around them calmly and entirely ignored, going on with their shopping and their gardening and their walking to school, as the dread note climbed and fell, unheeded, above their heads. A small child might be sitting at its desk in the schoolroom when the wail began, and the lesson would simply carry on without the smallest pause, the teacher's voice lifting a little to be heard over the noise of it, and the child would think nothing whatever of it. For the child had heard it every single week of its short life and knew it for no more than the harmless Monday voice of the hill. And yet, somewhere far down underneath all that easy ordinariness, every soul in those towns carried about with them, always, the buried knowledge of what the sound truly and terribly meant, knew in their hearts that on some Monday, or on some quiet Tuesday, or in the black middle of some ordinary night, the siren might one day sound out when it was not a test at all, and that then they must drop everything and run for their children and bolt fast their doors, because something had come down off the hill and was loose among the world. And so the asylum, which for so very long had kept nothing but its deep and patient silence, which had taken in its grieving mothers and its haunted painter, and its broken soldiers and its would-be killers of the Queen, and had held them all fast behind its wall, without ever once speaking a word, had at the very last been given a voice of its own to speak with, and the voice it was given was a long cry of warning and of dread. And it is strange and a fitting thing indeed, when you turn it over in your mind there in the dark, that a place which had been built from its very first brick to be hidden away, a place set out so far upon a lonely and an empty heath for the precise and particular reason that the comfortable world should never need to look upon it or to think of it, should in the end announce its own dark presence to the whole surrounding district, loudly and unmistakably, once in every single week, with the very loudest and the most dreadful sound that the tumult at the whole St. Alley, since the high wall hid away the people who were shut up inside it, hid their faces and their names and their sorrows, but the great bell could not be hidden, not by any wall, however high, and so the towns spread out below were never quite suffered to forget what it was that sat upon the hill above them, for the hill spoke down to them every Monday at 10, in the old, cold, remembered voice of war, and up on the windy ridge itself, behind the wall, the patients heard it too, of course. The very same wail rolling and breaking over their own grey rooftops and their own small barred windows. The warning that was sounded out into the world entirely on their account. And yet that meant nothing at all to them, for they were already gathered, already held fast, already counted and counted again. They heard it climb and fall and climb over the bare-walled yards where they walked their slow and patient circles in the cold, over the long workshops and the echoing corridors and the quiet chapel. And then they heard the single steady note of the all-clear come following after it. And then the morning was quiet once more, and the keepers turned their keys and counted their silent heads, just exactly as they always had and always would. Far down the hill, in the towns, the children bent their heads again over their lessons, and the shoppers went back to their shops, and the great voice of the hill fell silent for another 7 days. But the sound of it seemed to go on hanging in the cold, bright air a long moment after it had truly ended. The way a great struck bell will go on faintly trembling and singing in the air long after the hand has left it. A faint last shiver of dread laid over the ordinary Berkshire morning, fading slowly and ever more slowly, out across the pines and the rooftops and the wide green miles, growing thinner until at the very last there were no shadow of the hill. The small ordinary noises of the waking towns, going on quietly with their died. That down the local line, the slip about and they call Chapter 9, Wars Beyond the Wall. The hill heard other and far greater alarms than its own in its long time, for the long life of the asylum carried it on through years when the whole of the wide world itself seemed to take sudden leave of its senses, when the very madness that the place had been so carefully built to gather up and contain seemed instead to break its banks and spill out across the whole face of the earth, and great nations that called themselves sane and Christian and civilized fell upon one another with a blind fury that no single broker pate might manage them. Twice over, in the space of a single human lifetime, the great powers of the world went down into war, and twice over the deep quiet of the Berkshire, Heath was touched and troubled by the distant burning of the age, and the old red asylum, which had already stood upon its ridge for half a century and more when the first of those two great wars broke out, lived through them both there within its unbroken ring of iron and brick, and came out alive on the far side of each, only older and greyer and warier than it had been before. When the first of those two great wars came down upon the world, the one that swallowed up so much of the bright young manhood of a whole continent in the mud and the wire of its distant trenches, it reached in time even up to the lonely hill, and in a strange and an unlooked-for way. For across the narrow sea, among the great gathered armies of the enemy, there were soldiers whose own minds had cracked and broken under the long unbearable horror of the fighting. Just exactly as the minds of men in every land and every age have always broken under such things, and some few of these the shifting fortunes of the war delivered, as prisoners, into British hands. And so a decision was reached, high up, that one of the great blocks of the asylum, one of the long brick ranges standing upon the ridge, should be cleared right out of its own patients, and given over instead to these broken soldiers of the enemy, these captured men from the far side of the war, whose reason had altogether fled them. The patients who had lived in that block were gathered up and moved out, and lodged as best they could be in the other already crowded parts of the great house. And into their emptied rooms there came, instead, the foreign soldiers, the maddened sons of the enemy nation, to be kept and watched and tended upon a green English hill, as far from the roar of their own guns as it was well possible for a man to be. And it was a curious sort of mercy when you pause and truly consider it, that a country locked in a war to the very death against another should yet take in that same enemy's broken and maddened soldiers and house them and feed them and care for them behind the very same high walls that held fast its own afflicted and its own lost. And so for the long years of that first great war the strange company gathered upon the hill grew stranger yet. For now among all the English lost there were foreign voices too, men who spoke in the harsh tongue of the enemy, gathered together in their cleared and guarded block beneath the same indifferent grey, Berkshire say. every one of them as far from his own home and his own people as the turning world could set him. World could set him. The asylum had grown crowded almost past all bearing, long before ever that war came. For the courts down below in the cities never once ceased their patient and their grinding work, and year upon year upon year they sent up more of the broken and the dangerous and the strange than the place had ever been built or planned to hold. Even before the war, the hard-pressed government had been forced to open a second asylum, far away to the north, simply to take in the steady overflow, a sister house to ease a little the great press of bodies upon the hill, and they had raised an extra block as well, set out to the west of all the others, to make a little more room within the wall. But still they came, the grieving and the raving and the wandering, carried up the long private road in their closed and windowless carts, and still the keepers found beds for them somehow, and counted them, and set them to their work and their chapel and their slow circling walks in the bare yards. The hill that had first opened its gate to a single block of sorrowful and weeping women had become, by now, a whole crowded and hidden town of the afflicted. Hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of souls gathered behind the one high red wall, a town with no name upon any map, whose people never came and never went, but only ever came and never went, but only ever came. And the lives that the great place held within it were long, far longer than ever you might think to guess. For once a man or a woman had been carried up that road and shut away behind the wall during the pleasure of a crown that so very rarely ever troubled to change its royal mind. They might stay there not merely for a handful of years, but for the whole entire remaining span of their natural lives, which in some few cases ran on for a length of time that fairly beggars all belief. There was a boy once brought up to the hill in the old Victorian days when the place was still quite new. A Berkshire lad of only 10 years old, a child, sent up there for the crime of setting fires, and that small boy grew up behind the wall, and grew to be a man there, and grew old there, and grew loathed there, and the long years piled themselves up upon him one after another, while the whole world beyond the wall changed and changed again, past knowing, until at the very last he died upon the hill, an old man, having passed more than 70 long. Only think upon it, a soul who entered in through that gate as a small frightened boy in the far-off age of the old Queen, and who lived on there, quietly through both of the great wars and on for years beyond even them, who knew almost nothing in all his long, long life, the grey corridors and the bare yards and the weekly wail of the bell, and who is now wholly and entirely forgotten by the world, his name kept nowhere but in the dusty ledgers of the place. Such were the lives that the hill quietly swallowed up and held. Whole human spans of years poured away into the silence behind the brick, and the place took them in, and held them fast, and gave them back at the last only to the small unmarked burying ground that lay within its own grounds. And when the second great war came down upon the world, a darker and a wider and a more terrible one even than the first had been, the Heath came to know at last the true and the deadly meaning of that air-raid wail that its own bell would one day be given. For now the dreadful note sounded in deadly earnest all across the length and breadth of England, and the night skies above filled up with the heavy droning of engines as the enemy bombers passed over in the dark on their long way to the cities. A great and a heavy darkness was laid down upon the whole land in those years, for now every single window in every house in every town had to be covered over completely after the fall of night, so that no smallest chink or crack of light might shine up and guide the raiders down out of the sky. And the leafy Berkshire towns below the hill lay every night blacked out and silent and blind beneath the cold moon, and the great red house upon the ridge above them lay dark and silent and blind beneath the cold moon, and the great red house upon the ridge above them lay dark and silent among them. The patients and their keepers heard the warning sirens wail out in the darkness, the real ones now, in deadly earnest, and heard the far-off drone of the engines passing over high above, and waited there in the blackness, listening, just exactly as the whole frightened country waited and listened, for no wall, however high a man might build it, and no lock, however sound, could ever shut out a war of that kind, that came down at the very sky itself. And still, through all of it, through every black and anxious night of it, the slow daily round of the great place went on unbroken. The unlocking and the counting and the working and the chapel and the counting again, for the broken minds shut up within those walls did not cease for one single day to need their tending merely because the wide world outside the wall had gone stark mad with war. and so the keepers kept their strange charges all through the long dark years of it, as faithfully as they had kept them through the years of light and the hills. And when at the very last that second great war too had burned itself out into ash and exhaustion, and a weary and a battered and a half-ruined country set itself slowly and painfully to the long work of putting itself back together again, a quiet change came over the asylum upon the hill that was softer and stiller than any siren ever was, and yet that ran deeper down than all of them, for the age itself had begun, very slowly, to think a little differently about the people that it had once been so quick to shut away and to forget. The hard old words that had named the place for so long, the cruel, plain, blunt words of an earlier and a harsher time, began at last to seem a kind of shame to a gentler age that was struggling to be born, and so the law was changed once more, and that dreadful old name under which the hill had laboured for very nearly 100 years, the name that branded every single soul within its walls as a criminal and a lunatic, both at once, was struck away and gone. No longer would the place be called an asylum for criminal lunatics. The people held within it would no longer be called by those two hard and shaming names, but would be called instead, simply and plainly, patients, as the sick are called everywhere and always, and the great house upon the hill passed quietly out of the keeping of the prison men and into the care of the nation's great new service for the healing of the sick, the service that was meant, in its bright new hope, to tend to the ailing of the whole country alike, the rich man and the poor, without fear or favour shown to any. It was only a change of words in the end, and a change of masters, and the high wall still stood up just exactly as high as it ever had, and the great bell would very soon be given its wailing voice, and the men shut up within were guarded just as closely, and counted just as often as they had ever been in the hardest of the old days. But something all the same had shifted. Somewhere, some slow and quiet turning of the deep heart of the age, away from the old cold idea that these were monsters, to be hidden and forgotten, and toward a newer and a harder and a more hopeful thought that these were only sick and broken souls, who might yet, with care and with patience and with time, be in some measure healed. And the old red brick stood on through all of it, weathering and darkening, its towers and its barred windows and its long cold corridors growing older and greyer with each passing year, holding within them still the whole long and silent memory of everything that the place had been, and seen and held, while far below the hill the towns went on quietly about their lives and the wide world moved on, away from the war, into a new and an uncertain and unmapped time. Chapter 10. What the hill remembers, and so the great house upon the ridge passed at the last into our own age, carrying with it the whole long and heavy weight of all its history, all its grief, and all its strangeness. And we come now to the final turning of this long story, the part where we lift ourselves gently up and out of the deep past at last, and stand together, for one quiet moment, here in the present day, and look upon the hill as it truly is now. For everything that has a beginning written into it has an ending written there too, somewhere, and the old asylum that first swung open its cold iron gate in the far-off year of the old Queen could not stand on, unchanged and unchanging, forever and forever. The red brick that the convicts had laboured to raise up so very long ago grew older and older, with each passing decade as the new century wore slowly on, and the small barred rooms, and the long cold echoing corridors that had once seemed so modern and so sound and so well built in their distant day, came at the very last to seem the very opposite of all those things, came to seem grim and outdated and altogether unfit for the gentler and more hopeful care that a newer age had come to believe the sick and the broken were owed. The people whose task it was to come and inspect such places climbed up the hill and walked slowly through the old Victorian wards, and looked about them, and shook their heads, and they declared at the last, plainly and without much softening of it, that the old buildings were no longer any fit place in which to heal a single soul, that the very stones that had been so carefully built to hold the broken were now themselves standing squarely in the way of any mending of them. And so it was decided in the end, after much weighing and much argument, that the old house must at the last be left behind altogether. The nation found, somewhere, the very great sum of money that such a thing required, many hundreds of times over the sum that Sir Joshua Jebb had once laid out upon his first red walls, and they set about the building of a wholly new hospital, a modern one, low and clean and filled with light, upon the ground lying close beside the old. And to make the room for it, some of the very oldest parts of the old Victorian asylum had to be pulled down, and among them, sad to say, was the women's range, away to the east, the very first part of the whole great place ever to be built, and the very first to be filled, the range where the grieving mothers had once wept behind their bolted doors in the asylum's earliest and rainiest spring. The wreckers came at last with their machines, and the old female blocks were pulled down and carted away, the buildings that had borne, in their later years, the plain names of English counties and, most fittingly of all, the very name of the haunted painter who had spent his own last years upon the hill, and the ground where the first lost and weeping women had once lived and laboured and grieved, was cleared away to the bare earth to make way for what was to come after. And when at the last the new hospital was finished and ready, in a recent winter, now not so very many years gone by, the patients were moved out of the old Victorian buildings and into the bright new ones, and the great red house that had held the criminally afflicted of all England for more than a century and a half together, fell, at the very last, entirely silent, its long corridors standing empty, its small barred rooms standing vacant, and swept, and still, its long and its heavy work, finally and forever done. And yet much of the old place still stands, even now, even to this day, for it was judged at the last to be too fine, and too storied, and too much a part of the nation's own long history, to be pulled down entire and lost. And so the great gatehouse, with its square clock tower, still stands upon the hill, the very same tower whose new bell had once struck out the hour over the empty heath on the cold morning, when the whole place was raw and new, and the high outer wall still rings the old ground, around just exactly as it always did. If you were to travel today to that quiet corner of Berkshire, and to look up toward the wooded ridge, you would still see the long dark Victory front of the old asylum rising up among the tall pines, weathered now, and silent, and emptied, a protected and a guarded thing, kept and a guarded thing, kept and watched over for the sake of its long history, even though it holds no patients within it any longer at all. The new hospital stands close beside it, low and modern behind its own quiet defences, and there the long work still goes on, even now, for the country has need of such a place yet, and troubled and dangerous and broken men are still sent up to it, even in our own day, to be held and watched, and it is always hoped in time to be in some measure healed and made well. But the old red house only stands and watches over it all now, emptied at last of its long, long sorrow, and the pines still bend and sigh over it as they always have, and the wind off the wide heath still finds it and moves around it and passes on. And the great voice of the hill has fallen silent too at the last. For 60 years and more, every single Monday morning at 10 o'clock, the old air-raid wail had risen up and rolled out over the leafy Berkshire towns, until whole generations of children had grown up never once knowing a single week of their lives without it. But in time the keepers of the place judged at last that the old bell had outlived the purpose for which it had been raised, and a few years ago now the weekly testing of it was stopped and quietly ended, and one by one the great sirens were taken down from their tall masts and carried away, and now the Monday mornings come and go in those towns below, in an ordinary and an unbroken quiet that the older people living there still find strange and unsettling, listening, almost without ever meaning to, out of the deep old habit, for a walk it. The hill that once cried out its warning across the whole wide heath has gone quiet at the last, and the children of those towns now grow up in a silence that their own parents and their grandparents never knew. Let us stand, then, for one last moment, here in that present-day quiet, up on the windy ridge among the dark pines, and before we go at last, let us do the one quiet thing that this whole long story has been moving toward. All this while, which is simply to remember, softly, to by name, where their names are known, some of those whose lives the hill once gathered in. For behind all of the long talk of walls, and of locks, and of bells, and of the strange new judgment of a vanished age, these were people, every single one of them, real and breathing people who lived, and who were loved by someone, before ever they were lost, and they ought not to pass out of this story now, as mere nameless shadows on a hill. So let us remember first of all those few who were taken from the world by the broken minds the hill was built to hold, the innocent ones whose only part in any of this was to be standing, all unknowing, in the path of another's madness. Let us remember Robert Dadd, the gentle chemist down in Kent, who was killed one summer evening by the gifted son who loved him, and who could no longer, in his sickness, tell his own father from a demon out of the pit. Let us remember George Merritt, the working man of London, a husband, and the loving father of a whole houseful of young children, who was hurrying through the dark to his early shift at the brewery, when a sick stranger's waking nightmare found him there in the street, and let us remember his widow Eliza, left alone with all those children who somehow carried on without him. And let us remember, most gently of all, little Linda Bowyer, just 5 years old, out riding her brand new bicycle in a quiet village lane on a sunlit afternoon, who was lost in the few short, stolen hours that a man was loose and abroad from the hill. They each of them lived and laughed and were loved, before ever they were taken, and they should be named here and remembered. And let us remember too the great and silent multitude of the hill's own dead, the patients themselves, the grieving and the haunted and the strange and the lost, who were carried up that long private road in their closed and windowless carts, and who never ever came back down it again. Let us remember the very first of them all, that nameless young woman handed down stiff and blinking onto the bare grey gravel in the rainy spring of long ago, whose deep grief the cold records barely troubled themselves even to describe. Let us remember the haunted painter who covered the bare walls of the place with whole shining golden cities, while his own poor mind wandered lost and far away, and who lies still, even now, in the small burying ground within those very grounds, beneath the quiet Berkshire grass. Let us remember the hundreds upon hundreds of weeping mothers, and the broken and the captured soldiers from both the great wars, and the small boy of 10 years old who grew old and grey and died behind the wall, having known almost nothing else in all his long life, and all the countless others besides, whose names the old records never troubled to keep, who lived out the whole of their single lives in the silence and the shadow of the wall, and who were laid at the last in the unmarked ground upon the hill, with never a stone raised up to say that they had ever once been year at all a ball, or had ever been young. They are all of them quiet now, every one. The grieving mothers and the gifted painter, the gentle doctor with his crowded books, and the broken soldiers of the enemy, the boy who fired upon his queen, and the old queen herself who was so angered by it, the watchers and the watched alike, the towns below that learned to listen for the bell, and the great bell itself that has long since ceased its crying. The old red house stands empty upon its ridge, and the new one waits and works close beside it, and the wind still comes in off the wide heath, as it has come for 1,000 quiet years, and it has come for 1,000 quiet years, and moves through the dark and sighing pines, and finds the silent and the weathered walls, and passes on and is gone. The hour is very late now. The hill keeps its long, long memory. The names have been spoken softly into the dark, and over all of it, over the empty house and the quiet graves and the sleeping towns below, the night draws its deep stillness slowly closed, and holds it, and is still.